My fiancé's father laughed at my wedding speech, so I read his private emails instead. I was treated like a charity case by my wealthy in-laws. On the morning of the wedding, I found proof that the father-in-law was embezzling from the company I worked for. I didn't cancel the wedding. I changed the toast to an audit. Part 1. The weight of silence. They say that a man's wedding day is supposed to be the proudest moment of his life. A day where you stand tall, look the woman you love in the eye, and promise her a future built on a foundation of trust. But as I stood in front of the ornate mahogany mirror in the groom's suite, adjusting a silk tie that cost more than my first car, I didn't feel like a groom. I felt like a trophy that had been bought on clearance. It's a strange thing, feeling like a stranger in your own skin. The tuxedo fit perfectly, tailored by a man in Milan who didn't even know my last name, but the person staring back at me looked like an imposter. "Don't wrinkle the lapels, Elias," a voice boomed from the doorway. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Arthur Sterling, my soon-to-be father-in-law. I could smell his expensive Cuban cigars and the faint, metallic scent of success that seemed to radiate off him like a heat wave. Arthur didn't walk into rooms. He conquered them. He was the CEO of Sterling Global, the firm where I had worked as a senior analyst for the last 3 years. He was also the man who had spent the last 14 months making sure I knew exactly where I stood in the food chain. "It's a big day, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted it to. "It's a big day for my daughter," he corrected, stepping into the room and checking his gold Patek Philippe. "For you, it's an upgrade. Try not to trip over your own feet during the ceremony. My guests are watching." He didn't wait for a response. He never did. He just turned on his heel and vanished, leaving the heavy door to click shut with a sound that felt like a prison bolt sliding into place. I met Clara 3 years ago. It wasn't some grand cinematic encounter. I was a mid-level analyst, and she was the brilliant, laughing woman in the marketing department who always seemed to know when I needed a coffee. She was different from the rest of the Sterlings. She was warm. She was real. When we started dating, I didn't even know who her father was. By the time I found out, I was already in over my head. For the first year, things were perfect. We lived in a small apartment that smelled like toasted sourdough and old books. We talked about a future that was ours, not a legacy that was hers. But the moment the engagement ring touched her finger, the walls started closing in. Arthur didn't oppose the marriage. That would have been too simple. Instead, he absorbed it. He moved us into a suitable condo in the city, one he owned. He promoted me to a position that sounded prestigious, but mostly involved me fetching data for his private projects. Slowly, the charity case narrative began to circulate through the family dinners. "Isn't it wonderful what Arthur is doing for that boy?" I'd hear his sister whisper over sea bass. "He's a project," her cousin would laugh. "Every billionaire needs a stray to feed." I took it because I loved Clara, and I believed her when she squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Ignore them, Eli. We're building our own life." But we weren't. We were building Arthur's vision of our life. The morning of the wedding, the air in the coastal estate felt heavy, charged with the humidity of an incoming storm. I couldn't sleep. While Clara was in the bridal suite with a fleet of stylists, I wandered down to the library. I needed a moment of silence, a moment where I wasn't being told how to stand or what to say. Arthur's laptop was sitting on the desk, wide open. He had been working late into the night on the merger of the century, as the papers called it. I shouldn't have looked. I should have walked away and found a glass of water. But a notification popped up on the screen, an internal flag from the firm's compliance software, a software I had helped design. It was a red flag alert on an offshore account I recognized, an account that was supposed to be dormant. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I sat down, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. I told myself I was just checking to see if there was a technical glitch. I told myself I was protecting the company, but as I clicked through the folders, the reality began to settle in my stomach like lead. Arthur wasn't just a demanding father-in-law. He was a thief. The emails were clinical, cold, and devastating. He wasn't just managing the merger. He was siphoning millions into a shell company registered in his daughter's name, Clara's name. He was setting her up to be the fall girl if the audit ever went south. He was using our wedding as a distraction, a grand smokescreen to move the final tranche of funds while the board of directors was busy drinking his vintage champagne. And then I saw the email sent to his lawyer just an hour before. The boy is a non-entity. He'll sign the prenup with the updated disclosure clauses today. Once he's in the family, his testimony is neutralized by spousal privilege and the new NDA. We're clear. I sat there,
there, in the dim light of the library, the wedding march echoing faintly from the gardens outside where the musicians were warming up. I wasn't just a charity case. I was a legal shield. The man who was about to walk my bride down the aisle was planning to use her as a scapegoat and me as a silencer. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I didn't close the laptop. I didn't call the police. Not yet. Instead, I pulled a thumb drive from the desk drawer, copied the files, and felt the weight of my speech in my pocket. It was time to give the Sterlings exactly what they paid for.
Part 2. The Mask of the Groom. The thumb drive felt like a piece of dry ice in my pocket, searingly cold against my thigh. I walked out of the library, the heavy oak doors groaning behind, and found myself standing in the grand hallway of the Sterling estate. To anyone passing by, I was just a nervous groom taking a final walk before saying, "I do." In reality, I was a man carrying the demolition charges for the very house I was about to join. I saw Clara. She was standing at the end of the gallery, framed by a massive arched window that looked out over the Atlantic. She was breathtaking. The lace of her gown was intricate like frost on a window pane, and her hair was pinned back with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. When she saw me, her face lit up with that genuine, crooked smile that had made me fall for her in the first place. "Eli," she breathed, rushing over despite the protests of her trailing bridesmaids. "You're not supposed to see me. It's bad luck." I looked into her eyes, searching for a flicker of deceit. Was she in on it? Was the woman I loved truly a willing participant in her father's embezzlement? Or was she just another piece on Arthur's chessboard? "You look beautiful, Clara," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was warm, humming with the excitement day. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her brow furrowed. "Is it my father? Did he say something again?" I said exactly what I expected him to say. I replied truthfully. "Ignore him," she said, squeezing my hand. "In an hour, we'll be husband and wife. We'll be a team. No more charity case jokes. No more sterling global politics. Just us." I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to pull her aside, show her the files, and run away. But as I looked past her, I saw Arthur standing on the balcony above us. He was watching us, a glass of scotch in one hand, his face a mask of predatory satisfaction. He gave me a small, mocking toast with his glass, a silent reminder of who held the leash. If I told Clara now, the wedding would stop. Arthur would have hours to scrub the servers, move the money again, and paint me as a disgruntled employee trying to ruin his daughter's big day. He was too fast, too powerful. To stop a man like Arthur Sterling, you don't give him a head start. You wait until the cameras are rolling and the audience is seated. "I have to go get ready," I told her, kissing her forehead. "I'll see you at the altar." The next hour was a blur of scripted motions. I stood in the small chapel on the estate grounds, the scent of thousands of lilies cloying thick in the air. The who's who of the financial world filled the pews. Senators, CEOs, the very people Arthur was currently defrauding. When the music started and Clara began her walk down the aisle, the room fell into a reverent silence. Arthur walked beside her, his chest puffed out, the picture of a proud, protective patriarch. He looked like a man who had won everything. As they reached the altar, Arthur took Clara's hand and placed it in mine. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive peat and peppermint. "Remember the speech, Eli," he hissed under the cover of the music. "Make it short, make it great." The ceremony passed in a fever dream. The vows, the rings, the I-do's. I felt like an actor hitting my marks in a play that had already been canceled. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, a cheer went up that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I kissed my wife, and for a fleeting second, the guilt nearly choked me. But then I felt the thumb drive in my pocket. I remembered the email. The boy is a non-entity. The reception was held in a massive glass pavilion on the cliffside. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays of caviar and champagne that cost $400 a bottle. It was a monument to excess, built on the foundation of stolen capital. Arthur took the stage first. He was a master orator. He spoke of family, of legacy, and of the bright young man his daughter had chosen. He managed to compliment me in a way that felt like a pat on the head for a dog that had finally learned to sit. "And now," Arthur said, his voice booming through the speakers, "I'd like to invite my new son-in-law, Elias, to say a few words. I'm sure he has a lot to be thankful for today." The room chuckled. I felt the heat of a
100 gazes on me. Clara beamed from the head table, her eyes shining with pride. I stood up. I didn't take the printed speech out of my jacket. I left it there, the words of the grateful charity case discarded. Instead, I walked toward the tech booth where the wedding photographer was projecting a slideshow of our journey onto the massive 20-foot LED screens behind the stage. I handed him the thumb drive. "Change of plans," I whispered. "Play the files in the evidence folder instead of the childhood photos. Now." The technician looked confused, but I had the groom boutonniere on my lapel and a look in my eye that didn't invite questions. He plugged it in. I stepped up to the microphone. The feedback squealed for a second before settling into a low hum. "Good evening, everyone," I began. My voice was steady now. The shaking had stopped. "Arthur is right. I do have a lot to be thankful for. I'm thankful for the truth, because today I learned that a wedding isn't just a union of two people. Sometimes it's a merger, and sometimes a merger is just a cover for a crime." The room went deathly silent. I saw Arthur's glass pause halfway to his lips. "I had a speech written about how lucky I am to join this family," I continued, glancing back at the screen as the first image appeared. It wasn't a photo of me and Clara at the beach. It was a high-resolution screenshot of a wire transfer for $4.2 million to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. But I think these figures speak much louder than I ever could.
Part 3. The audit. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the polite silence of a wedding ceremony. It was the vacuum of a room that had just had the air sucked out of it. I could hear the rhythmic thump-thump of the waves hitting the cliffs outside the glass pavilion and the faint, frantic clicking of the photographer's camera. On the 20-foot screen behind me, the cold blue light of the spreadsheet illuminated the room. Rows of account numbers, offshore routing codes, and the name Clara Sterling listed as the sole beneficiary of a shell corporation called Aegis Holdings. I looked at Clara. Her face had gone from a radiant bridal glow to a sickly ashen gray. Her mouth was parted, her hand still resting on the silk tablecloth next to her half-eaten lobster. She looked at the screen, then at her father, then back to me. "Eli?" she whispered. It wasn't a question, it was a plea. Arthur, to his credit, didn't panic, not at first. He stood up slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced ease of a man who had survived a dozen board meetings from hell. He forced a chuckle, a dry, rattling sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I think the groom has had one too many glasses of vintage Krug," Arthur said, his voice projecting to the back of the room with terrifying authority. "Elias, son, let's get you some water. Technicians, turn that off, now." The technician at the booth fumbled, but I had already locked the drive with a secondary script I'd written in the library. The screen didn't go dark. Instead, it scrolled to the next file, the email to his lawyer. "The boy is a non-entity. His testimony is neutralized. We're clear." The collective gasp from the room was like a physical wave. These were Arthur's peers, men and women who knew exactly what neutralized meant in a legal sense. They knew the language of a setup when they saw it. "I'm not drunk, Arthur," I said, my voice echoing through the speakers, calm and steady. "And I'm not your son. I was your senior analyst, and as an analyst, I couldn't help but notice that the dowry you were so publicly bragging about was actually $3.8 million stolen from the Sterling Global Pension Fund." Arthur's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen on a human being. The mask of the benevolent patriarch finally cracked, revealing the snarling predator underneath. He stepped toward the stage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You ungrateful little gutter rat," he hissed, forgetting the microphone was still live. "I plucked you out of a cubicle. I gave you a life. I gave you my daughter." "No," I countered, looking him dead in the eye. "You gave your daughter a criminal record. You put her name on those accounts, Arthur. You were going to let her take the fall if the SEC ever came knocking. You weren't building a legacy for her. You were building a human shield." At the head table, Clara let out a choked sob. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. She looked at the screen, at the signature on the Aegis Holdings Incorporation papers. It was her signature, likely slipped into a stack of routine wedding paperwork her father had asked her to sign months ago. She turned to Arthur, her voice trembling. "Dad, is this
Is this true? Arthur didn't look at her. He was staring at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. He's lying, Clara. He's manipulated the data. He's trying to extort us because he knows he's nothing without this family. Then why is there a wire transfer scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow? I asked, pointing to the screen where the pending transaction was highlighted in red. The morning after the wedding, the moment we're officially joined, making it nearly impossible for me to testify against you without incriminating my own wife. The room began to murmur, a low, angry drone. People were standing up, some reaching for their phones, others backing away from Arthur as if he were suddenly radioactive. The merger of the century was dying in real time, right next to the three-tiered wedding cake. Arthur realized then that he couldn't charm his way out of this. He lunged for the stage, his hand reaching for the microphone, but I stepped back, out of his reach. The police are already on their way, Arthur, I said, though it was only half true. I had sent the files to an anonymous tip line at the SEC and the local precinct 20 minutes before I walked onto the stage. But before they get here, I want everyone to know one thing. I turned to the guests, to the investors, the politicians, the family members who had looked down their noses at me for years. I didn't do this for revenge, I said, my voice softening. I did it because I loved Clara, and I couldn't let her marry a man who would let her go to prison to save his own skin. I looked back at Clara. She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, ruining the expensive makeup. She looked at the ring on her hand, the diamond that was likely bought with stolen pension money. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she twisted the ring off her hand. She didn't throw it. She didn't scream. She simply set it down on the table next to her untouched dinner. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the salt air of the coast. Arthur looked at his daughter, then at the screen, then at the doors where the first of the blue lights were beginning to flash against the glass. For the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling looked small.
Part 4. The Fall of the House of Sterling. The sirens didn't stop at the gates. They tore through the manicured gravel of the driveway, their blue and red lights strobing against the glass pavilion like a frantic heartbeat. For a moment, the room was suspended in a surreal tableau. The high society guests in their silks and furs, the half-eaten lobster thermidor, and the towering digital evidence of a felony projected behind the groom. Arthur didn't run. Men like him don't run. They negotiate until the handcuffs click. He smoothed his suit jacket one last time, his jaw set in a hard, jagged line. He looked at me, not with the fiery rage from moments ago, but with a cold, analytical detachment. To him, I was no longer a stray dog. I was a market variable he had failed to account for. "You've ruined her, Elias," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the approaching sirens. "You think you're saving her. You've just tied her name to the biggest financial scandal in this city's history. You've destroyed her future to satisfy your own ego." "No, Arthur," I replied, stepping down from the stage. "I didn't tie her name to anything. You did that when you forged her signature on the Aegis documents. I'm just the one untying the knot." The doors to the pavilion swung open, and 4 officers in dark windbreakers entered, followed by 2 men in suits who looked far too tired for a Saturday night. They were from the SEC's enforcement division. I had recognized one of them from a compliance seminar I attended years ago. The room erupted. Guests began to scramble, some trying to slip out the side exits to avoid being associated with the fallout, others pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. The wedding photographer, ever the professional, was still snapping photos, though I doubted these would make it into the leather-bound album Clara had picked out. "Arthur Sterling?" the lead agent asked, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the misappropriation of funds from the Sterling Global pension accounts." Arthur didn't say a word. He held out his wrists with a practiced, stoic dignity that made my skin crawl. As they led him away, he didn't look back at the company he had built, or the friends who were now whispering behind their hands. He didn't even look at me, but he looked at Clara, and for a split second I saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. Not regret, but perhaps the realization that he had finally lost his most valuable asset. Clara was still standing by the head table, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the back of her chair. The bridesmaids were hovering around her, offering platitudes that sounded like white noise. She looked at the officers leading her father away. Then her eyes drifted to the screen, which was still frozen on the email describing me as a non-entity. I walked toward her, my heart heavy with a mixture of relief and profound sadness. I knew what I had
just done. I had saved her from a prison cell, but I had burned her world to the ground to do it. "Clara," I said soft. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Did you know? Before today? Did you know he was doing this?" "I found out this morning, in the library. I went in to find some peace, and I found that." She looked at the ring sitting on the table, the symbol of a future that had evaporated in the span of a 20-minute speech. "You could have told me, Eli. We could have handled it differently." "If I'd told you, he would have known," I said, reaching out to touch her hand, but she pulled away. "He would have moved the money. He would have erased the trail. I had to do it this way. I had to make sure there was no way for him to hide." She looked around the room at the wreckage of her wedding day. The flowers were wilting under the heat of the spotlights, and the cake was beginning to lean. "You used our wedding day as a trap, Eli. You used me as bait." "I used the truth to set you free," I countered. "He was going to let you go to jail, Clara. He was setting you up to be the face of the fraud." She let out a short, bitter laugh that broke into a sob. "And now I'm the face of the scandal anyway. Everyone in this room, everyone in this city is going to think I was her partner. My name is on those papers, Eli. Because of you, the whole world knows it." She didn't wait for my response. She turned and ran out of the pavilion, her white dress billowing behind her like a ghost, leaving me standing alone in the center of the debris. The police cleared the room shortly after. The lights were dimmed, the music was silenced, and the merger of the century was officially over. I sat on the edge of the stage, the thumb drive back in my pocket, watching the cleaning crew begin to stack the chairs. I was the groom who had saved the company, the man who had exposed the villain. But as I looked at the empty seat where my wife was supposed to be, I realized that justice is often a very lonely victory.
Part 5. The Quiet After the Storm. The following months were a masterclass in silence. The headlines had been loud, of course. The altar audit, the tabloids called. Arthur Sterling's face was plastered across every financial news cycle, usually positioned right next to a photo of me in my tuxedo, looking like a man who had just set his own house on fire to kill the termites. Arthur eventually took a plea deal. The evidence I'd pulled from that library was too surgical, too deep to ignore. He's serving 10 years in a federal facility now. He still sends me letters, legal threats mostly, written on thin, gray paper. I don't open them. I lost my job at Sterling Global, naturally. The board of directors saw me as a whistleblower, but also as a liability. In the corporate world, they appreciate honesty, but they fear the man who can't be bought. I didn't mind. I took a job at a small nonprofit that investigates financial elder abuse. I earn a fraction of what I used to, but for the first time in years, the air in my office feels clean. The hardest part wasn't the career shift or the lawyers. It was the space beside me in bed. Clara and I didn't stay together. The bridge I had burned to stop her father was the same bridge we were supposed to walk across. Even though the SEC cleared her of all charges, thanks to the metadata on those emails proving she had no knowledge of the accounts, the stain remained. She moved to a small town in Vermont, where the name Sterling doesn't carry the weight of a dynasty. We spoke once, 6 months after the wedding that wasn't. We met in a quiet park, far away from the cameras. She looked different, simpler. The pearls were gone. "I hated you for a long time, Eli," she said, watching a group of children play near the fountain. "I hated you for making me a spectator in my own destruction. I know. I'm sorry it had to be that way. The thing is," she continued, finally looking at me, "I went back through my old journals. I looked at the things he had me sign over the years. I realized that if you hadn't done what you did, I would be sitting in a cell right now, wondering why my father wasn't answering my calls. You broke my heart, but you saved my life. We didn't reconcile. Some things are too broken to be glued back together, no matter how much you value the pieces." But as she walked away, I felt a weight that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I live in a small apartment now. It smells like roasted coffee and old books, just like our first place did. Sometimes I sit on the balcony and watch the city lights, thinking about that night in the glass pavilion. I think about the look on Arthur's face when the truth finally caught up to him. I learned that day that loyalty isn't about protecting someone's secrets. It's about protecting their soul, even if they hate you for it. I was a charity case who ended up paying the highest price of all. But I can look at the man in the mirror now, and for the first time, I recognize him. He's a man who chose the truth over a kingdom. And in the end, that's the only legacy worth keeping. Integrity is a quiet, heavy thing. We often think that doing the right thing will lead to a perfect ending, but life is messier than that. Sometimes the truth is a fire that saves the forest by burning away the rot, even if it leaves us standing in the ashes for a while. Would you have done what I did? Would you have sacrificed your wedding day to expose a truth that would change change everything? Let me know in the comments.